Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we're excited for our last workshop of the day. And hopefully, you guys will get some good tips on and see how that can help you this weekend as well. So now I'm going to pass the mic over to our workshop host, who is Mr. Russell Diaz.
Yes, hey guys, good evening to you all. I'm in IST, so it's pretty early in the morning for me. Great. So let me just give you a quick background who I am, what I do before I get into all of this, right? So I'm actually a 22-year-old software engineer who's completely self-taught, and I have actually studied design as my graduate, and I've picked up software while I dropped out from my master's, and like I really wanted to pursue what I do. So I'm like, yep, I guess it's time for me to really do what I do, and I don't think like my degree mattered, right? And I just didn't want that to be the case, so I pushed myself in order to learn software, and then I picked it up. I currently work with a company called Archimedes, and I'm the front end engineer over there. And we work on a couple of interesting projects as well. So yeah, that's basically about me. So let's just get into the workshop. Is it fine if I can start now?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. And if any questions come up in the chat, I will just let you know.
Great. All right, no worries. All right, so let's just begin in that case. So I specialize in building web apps with React, right? So you might be wondering, what is React? So the whole web is written in a couple of languages, namely HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So JavaScript's pretty cumbersome sometimes when it comes to larger projects. So people have built frameworks. React is built by Facebook, and it's a pretty neat framework which standardizes a lot of ways you build applications for the web, as well as just and scale your application as it grows, right? So what is React? Like I said, it's a JavaScript framework built for basically built for user interfaces, right? It's super simple to use, like it's really easy and it's super powerful, right? And it's really awesome. Like there's a huge community of supporters behind React. Okay, so why would someone pick React, right? Number one, like I mentioned, the documentation is pretty extensive. It is super easy to use, and I'm sure you'll pick it up in a couple of weeks. Since JavaScript was the first language I picked, it took me a couple of months, I would say up to like 6 months to just pick up React. But once you're set, it's kind of easy. Like if you already have experience with another language, it shouldn't be much of an issue. So React has amazing performance because the way a browser works is you use something called the DOM, the document object model. So the way apps work is by manipulating this. So that's how you see changes on a site, etc. Right? But React doesn't directly manipulate the DOM. It creates a virtual DOM. It manipulates the virtual DOM because it's far easier, and then it matches it with the DOM, which really helps in your performance. And that's kind of how it works, right? So the core functionality of React is building components. So you build components and then you compose them into a larger app, right? So what is a component, you might be wondering? A component can be anything that returns something called JSX, which we will get to. So you can return something like maybe called a button, or maybe an input, or just like text. That can be a component. And you can use this component in hundreds of places, or just like one place. It doesn't really matter. And the last amazing thing about React is it's a really active community, which is on GitHub, which is on Twitch, Slack, everywhere, right? And it's a really active community with people constantly evolving and making it a better experience for everybody. Right. Okay, so let's just go through four main concepts. I'm not going to have too much of slides because let's get to code quick, right? So the first thing, like I mentioned, is component-based thing. So you write your components in either class-based or you can write it in function-based. So let's take a look at how a function-based component would look like, right? So you declare a function. I'm going to call this function or component, my component, and you'll see what's this thing, right? So I'll get back to props. So basically you write a function that returns something like this. This is not HTML. It is something called JSX, which I will get to again. JSX is super cool. So you'll really find it really interesting as we move along. Right, so basically this is how it works. For it to be a valid React component, you have to return this. So you can have various other logic inside your components, but at the end of the day, it has to return JSX. Right, so let's move on to the next thing called JSX. So what is JSX? JSX is basically an extension of JavaScript that is used in React and in all the components, right? So let's take a look at JSX. So you would see something like this. An example of JSX would be, let's create a constant of time and let's create a new instance of the date, and we'll convert it to string. Now in regular HTML, you won't be able to reference anything like this. So in order for you to do this in JSX, you'll have to open curly braces. And the moment you drop curly braces, anything inside it is valid JavaScript, right? So you will not see the string called time. Rather, you will see the JS version of it, which will be the current date string, which will be inserted over here. That's basically JSX, right? So you can have a lot of logic inside your HTML, which makes it super interesting and just opens up a lot of possibilities, right? So let's move on to the next one called component state. So state is a very important concept in React, wherein the way it works is you'll have to so there'll be certain parts of your application that you'll have to like expect the component itself to remember certain things or save certain things. For example, if the user has clicked on a particular button and you want to remember that, you can use state to store it, and you can always reference back to it, right? So the way state works is it works component wise, as well as there are certain life cycles, which is a little bit advanced topic, but I'm not going to get into it today. But the way it works is you can save stuff, you can reference stuff, and it is always there as long as your component is mounted on screen and you can always access it, right? So let's just take an example of how it looks. So basically you see I'm using a function-based thing. So if you are using a function-based component, you'll have to use something called hooks, right? Because that's the way you can use state in React. So we're going to use a hook called useState. And so let me just explain the syntax to you. So useState is a function that will return two items to you. The first item being the variable itself. So you can name this whatever it is. I just call it state here. And the second thing it returns is a function, which is a setter function. So the convention in React is you name the function, the starting of the function with set, and you can name the second half with whatever your variable name is. And you see the empty string here. So this is an initial value, right? So I can always have the initial value as like hello world, for example, and that is what will be referenced with this. All right, so as you see what's happening here in the JSX, I have state stored, which currently is an empty string, but then you see there's a button called add text, and to handle an event called on click. So whenever I click this button, this function gets triggered, which I'm telling React to do here. And it is basically setting the state called text added. So what happens is the moment I click, this text is saved here, and then this is referenced back here. So the new text is not going to be an empty string, rather it's going to be text added. So state's a little complex understanding of React, but once you do get the hang of it, it's pretty easy to like understand how stuff works. So let me move on to the last bit. That's called the prop system. So the prop system is a very interesting bit where you can only pass data down into components. So like I mentioned before, React basically has components that you compose them, and so you have to place them inside. So the component that contains another component is called a parent component, and the component that is inside a parent component is called a child component. And the way this works is from a parent, you can pass data down to the child, but you cannot pass it the other way around. There are workarounds to do this. Like for example, you can pass in a function, pass in a function from your parent, pass in the data from your child, and then you can access it back in your parent. But if you want to use something like that, you'd rather use something called global state, which you're not going to be getting into, but it's an interesting read. You can check that out too. So let me just show you an example quickly of how props works. So you see here, there is a parent component, there's a child component, and the parent component has state called text, and it contains a string called hello world. And I am referencing my child component here, and you see I am passing something called text, right? And text is called a prop, or short for properties, and this text is receiving this text over here, which is the state, as a variable. So in my child component, the way I can access it, like I mentioned before, there's this world called props. So each component will get props no matter what, right? And there's a compulsory prop always called children, but that's something we won't be getting into here. But basically, you get children. um, you can read up a little bit on it. Children, just to give you a summary, if you open and close a function, like for example, if this is a function and anything in between the opening and closing tag is called a child, and if you say props.children, you will basically get what is in between here. But in order to reference text, I'll just have to, since props is an object, I'll have to reference it by props.text, right? So basically, this is a quick, super quick rundown of what React is. So let's just get writing some code, right? So let's jump to a React project. So I've created the React project with create React app. I will also post this on GitHub for your reference. So the app we'll be building today is a super simple to-do application where you have a text box where you can just type in text, as well as it'll render out all of them. And at the end of it, we'll also implement something where you can clear everything, right? Like clear all your to-dos. So let me just run you through the hierarchy of how these things work. So I have a folder called source. Source will have something called index. I'm using TypeScript for this, but you can use JavaScript too. I'll write it in JavaScript and then convert it to TypeScript, so people who know TypeScript can also get a good look of it. Right. So your index .tsx is basically your entry point into the application, right? So you start off by referencing your component over here, right? So the moment you reference your component over here, this is your main thing, right? So inside here is where my main component lies, right? It's called to do app. I'll get to what this does. And this is how I'm breaking it down. So I'm adding all my components in components. The convention here is naming your file, a file name with a first letter being capital. So I've called this to do app.tsx. If this is JavaScript, you would name this to do app.jsx. That's about it, right? So let's just go through what happens. So let me just start the server by hitting npm start. And while that's going on, I'll just explain to you what this does. Right, so let me just close this out. Great. So I'm returning a div. This div basically contains one h1 tag that is going to return to do app with ReactJS. That's about what we should be expecting to see, and you can see the same here. So I'm going to be using a few things to make things easier, because everyone can use them just like to speed up your time, right? So we usually use a UI framework such as Material UI, but I'll be using Ant Design for this particular example, which I've already installed in my NPM package. Great. So we'll be using that in order to get the button, in order to get the input, etc. Right. So let's just begin. So the first step of the way is for us to create a form, and this form is going to contain input and is going to contain a button. And there's going to be a few concepts as to how an input works, because you'll have to use something called a control component, right? And to control the state of it. So let's just start by creating a form element, right? So I'm going to create a form. And over here, I'm basically going to pass it input, right? And close tag here, but I need input from somewhere, right? So let me import it from Ant Design. So I can destructure it out since it's a single thing. I'm going to get input, right? And I also need a button. So let me just go ahead and get the button from Ant. Yes, great. So actually, I need to pass in add to-dos. So you see what here, I'm just passing it like this. So this is basically a child, right? So that's how the button is going to read it. So let's just go here and refresh the screen. So you see, we already have an input, we already have a button. So let's go ahead and try to add some styling. So just for the purposes of this, I've already created a CSS file. CSS is basically cascading style sheets. This is the part of the web that styles everything, right? So I've already created these things, and I'm just going to reference them just for simplicity's sake right now. So we finish up faster. So in order to reference it, I'm going to add class name. If you know CSS, you add classes through that. And I'm going to open curly braces, reference something called styles, which I'm importing on top. I'm importing styles as an object, and each CSS is going to be an object, right? So styles dot input and button container, right? So let's just go. We should get this on a single line. Great. So let's just work with a little bit more style over here. So let's add a size of large on both the button as well as the input. So it looks slightly bigger, and also to give it a slightly better UX, let's also make this button primary. So let's just make sure it's blue rather than white right now, right? So it's not really clear. That's a call to action. So let's just go to type. Type is primary, right? So that should solve the issue. Great. So now let me just open the console and leave it here on this. So you'll see if I type something, it's there, but it's really not getting saved anyway. If I hit enter, it just refreshes, right? So in order to do that, we'll have to wire up some sort of state to this. So to the input, so the input knows where exactly it has to be saved. So let's just go ahead and quickly create a hook. So let's say const an array is equal to use state. Use state gets imported from React, as you can see on top here, right? And this is going to initially be an empty string. So I'm going to name this, let's say to do, because this is a to do, and we're going to say set to do. Right. So now the way this works is each input is going to get a value. A value is going to be something that's initially read, right? So for example, let's just set this first, and let's just say hello world over here. So basically my input's going to have a value of to do, which is hello world, as you will see here. It's pre-filled, but I cannot really like do anything. I cannot type anything, nothing. So every time you do hit any key, there is an event triggered, and you will have to handle that event in order to save this or even add anything new. So it's called an on change, right? So you'll see here, every input is going to have an on change, and on change takes a function. So let's just quickly write that down, right? So let's just say const on change to do. Let's just name this function that. Let's create ES6 function, and let's basically we need to set a to do with the value of what is in here. So how do we get that value? So firstly, let's go ahead and paste this in, and you will receive something called an event object. Right? An event object will eventually have event. So you can pick it up at event dot target dot value. But you'll see this is throwing an error here. I'm getting like this doesn't apply. So basically, if you hover over here, this is only for TypeScript folks. You can just copy the type, which is over here. So you know exactly what so TypeScript knows, and it doesn't throw you an error. And let's just test it out. So what's going to happen is the moment I change anything, even if I add a single key, this function is going to be triggered, and it's going to set the value of whatever currently is in the input over here. So let me just add something called a pre-tag, so we can take a look at how it looks. So JSON.stringify to do null to. Great. So now we'll basically be seeing the state. So let's just make sure this is an empty string. So we'll see the same over here. So if I type anything here, you can see it now keeps updating, right? Hey, so you can see. So let me just quickly run through what's happening here. So we've created a state that contains a to do, and this same to do initially is an empty string that gets passed down to your input, and it will show over here in this box. So every time there is an event that is triggered called on change, we are triggering this function. This function is going to take the current value of whatever is inside the input and save it to our to do. So we always have access to it, and we can use this in any part of this component. Great. Now that we have that, let's just go ahead and look at our next thing we have to do is, now that we are saving single to-dos, what we have to ideally do is when we type out something and we hit enter, it shouldn't refresh like what it's doing right now. Rather, it should start showing us a list of these to-dos, right? So let's go ahead and start off with that. So in order for me to do that, I need to save it somewhere. And the best place to save it, obviously, is state. So let's just call this to-dos with a plural, right? So let's say to-dos is equal to use state. And we are going to use something called an array, right? So that's what we're going to be using here. So this is how you like invoke an empty array. So I'm starting off with an empty array. And if you have any idea how an array works, the array is basically a set of items that, so you can always be like, for example, it can be an empty string. It can be like an empty string called hello, and then it can have another one called world, right? So these are different strings. They're not the same inside the array, and you can basically reference them in different ways, which we will come to. Right. Okay, so let's just start. So this is an empty array. So what we need to do is we're going to map over something, right? So we're going to use JSX here. So in order to use JSX, let's open curly braces, like I mentioned. Now anything inside here is valid JavaScript. Since we know to-dos is an array, we can use the map function. And the way map works is it's going to go through every instance of the array, every item in the array, and it's going to return that item. And for each and every item, we are going to render it out. So let's just start with that, right? Let's say to-dos dot map, right? So now let's just say to do. So since we are going to be iterating to every single item of the array, we are going to be getting a single to do, not this to do, but a single to do. So let's not make that confusing. Let's call it item, right? So let's write a function inside here, and I'm going to basically return something. I'm going to return a div, and I'm just going to return item. As of right now, let's just leave it at this, right? So nothing's going to happen here because we really haven't hooked up what happens, and nothing is really getting saved to a to do. So let's work on that first. So if you add anything in a form and you have a button inside, so whenever you hit this button, it's going to submit something, right? So firstly, let's tell HTML that this type of this function is a submit, right? So whenever this button is clicked, HTML knows to go back up to the form and trigger something called an on submit. Right, so let's just leave on submit as is right now. Let's write the function and let's see what it does, right? So let's do const on submit. This is a function that we are not going to be receiving anything through this, not that we require. So let's not worry about that. So let's just go ahead and reference this on submit over here. So what's going to happen is at this point, when we hit enter, we know that we have our to do in to do, and we need to save it inside to do's the array, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So let's firstly go to set to do's, and we're going to open out empty array, and we're going to use a spread operator. So basically a spread operator is when you like take the current set of arrays and then remove that array and inject it into another array, just like the word suggests, is spreading it out into another array. So let's just do that. So dot to do's. Remember, it's this to do's because it's an array, and then we're going to add to do. This to do is coming from, my bad, to do. So this is coming from here. So the way this, I'll explain this error, but the reason why we're doing it in this way is because we don't want to override anything in this array. So we're going to take whatever is currently there in the array and add it in, and then also add the new item we have. So you'll see this error. This error is not going to happen in JavaScript. It's only going to happen in TypeScript, because TypeScript's telling me like you cannot add strings into an array, right? Because this is just a plain empty array. So in order to fix that, we're going to pass something called a generic. We're going to tell it it's going to be a string and an array at the end of it, signifying that it's going to be an array of strings, right? So we can do the same thing on top, because we know this is always going to be a string. We can just say string. So that's how TypeScript helps you with type safety. Right, and the second thing we need to do is set the to do, which is this, to an empty string, because we are resetting this, right? So let's just test how this looks in real life, right? So I'll just remove the pre tag here, so we have everything set. So let's just say hello and hit enter. Oh, I just missed something, my bad. Yes, we need to prevent default over here, so we do not have. The reason why we prevent default, as you saw, normal browser behavior is when you hit enter, you're going to refresh the site, right? So we need to prevent that. And we also, so we are going to get a function here it's going to be event. See, we can remove it off here. We can just add it here. And we're going to be getting a type called form element. So on submit, it by default, the browser is going to refresh, and we do not want that to happen. So we're just telling it to prevent default behavior, right? So now if you see text, you will not see a refresh, right? So you can see it's rendering it out. Hello world, right? So let's add some styling to this, as well as you see an interesting error that says it should have a unique key. So the interesting thing is, though, every time you map something, you have to pass the topmost element, such as this div, which is the topmost element, something called a key. So why a key, right? So the way React works, as I mentioned, it uses the virtual DOM. So it has to keep track of all these things in real time in order for it to have a sense of how what to render, I mean, what to change, what not to change. So let's quickly go ahead and fix this issue. So in order to fix this, let's just go ahead and create a new component called to do item, which is very simple. So let me just get rid of this for right now. Let me just render out to do item, right? And yes, so let's see what to do item does. To do items, as you already see, just returns a div and it just returns to do item components. Now we need to pass it a prop, right? Like we had mentioned earlier, and this prop is going to be the item, as we already know how it renders out, right? So let's just go ahead and pass props here. And all we're going to do is just open curly braces. So we reference the JSX. We're going to hit props dot, let's just call it to do. So we're going to pass something called to do, right? Now let's go ahead and do that. So let's create a prop called to do, which will consume the item that is being mapped over here. Now you will see I'm getting an error. This is going to be only a TypeScript error. So TypeScript folks, go ahead, create an interface, create props, and you have to tell TypeScript explicitly, I'm going to receive a prop call to do, which is a string, right? And in order for us to pass, let's just tell it it's a React functional component, open a generic and pass props here. So that error is gone, and we also get autocomplete. So we know what's in prop. So we know this to do. And like I mentioned, this children before too. So let's just use a little bit of ES 2016. Let's remove props and destructure to do out of it. And we can just reference to do. Right. So like I mentioned before, let's get back to the key element. So we need to pass in a key. So key has to be a unique ID. Ideally, you would get an ID, but since this is just a quick demo, we're not creating an ID or anything. So let's just use the index of this as of right now. So let's just pull out the index of the current item, and let's just pass that as a key, right? So also to add some styling before we leave here, I've already imported the style. So let's just say styles dot to do item, and it should add some styles for us. Let me just show you what the styles look like. Yes, so basically this is the style. So it's just gonna add a background color, some padding, and all of these things, and also an on hover. So let's just see how that looks like, right? So let's hit test again, and there we go. So it's all style, and on when you hover over something, it's gonna like highlight a little bit. Let's just say world, and you'll see now whenever you highlight over something, you do see on hover, you see some shadow. So let's quickly add one last functionality. Is we need the functionality to clear out all of these things, because we are not aware, right, when it's getting cleared out, nothing, nor do we have that functionality. So in order for us to do that, as we know, we are saving this into, let me just close this out, into the to-dos array. So all we have to do is set it to an empty array, and this should automatically get reset, right? So firstly, how do we do that? Let's add in a button below this. Let's call this button clear to-dos, right? Just very descriptive, and it's always here. But let's not have like it looking like a huge button. Let's have it looking like a link, right? So let's tell it to have a type of link, and it's going to be a little bit more subtle. So now on click of this is when we'll now, as of right now, nothing happens. So on when someone clicks it, we have to handle this event, and we are going to set the array to an empty, set the to-dos to an empty array. So let's quickly go ahead, create that. Let's say const on clear is a function that will set to-dos to an empty array, and also set to do to an empty string. So this is going to be reset, and this is going to be reset, as you see. So now the way we're going to pass it down here is very simple. So we're going to say every time someone clicks on this button, go ahead and call a function called onClear, and onClear is going to set to-dos to an empty array, invariably resetting the whole thing, as well as set to do to an empty string. So let's see how that works. So let's just say test, hit enter, and let's hit clear to-dos, and there we go, it's cleared. So let's just add a few more things before we leave. So we're going to, since we're using ant design, we get something called message. Message is the super cool little notification that you tell your user like, hey, we've cleared it. So let's quickly use this on clear, right? So let's just say message dot success, and we're going to tell it to show cleared to do's, right? So we'll get to what this does, but there's also an issue, right? We are seeing to do's even though there is clear to do's, even though there's nothing to clear. So let's just work with that. Since we know this is an array and the current length of the array is 0, if it is 0, it's going to be empty and we don't need to show this, right? So now that we know the logic of it, let's implement that. So let's cut out the button. Let's throw in a couple of tags so we can use JSX logic here. So let's just say to do's dot length. Okay, if it's greater than 0, then go ahead and return button, right? So what's going to happen here is this is going to evaluate, React is going to evaluate if to do's dot length, if the length of it is greater than 0, only if this first condition is met, then will we show this JSX button. If not, it's going to return nothing. So that means it's not going to show, right? It's going to return null. So let's test that out. As you see, it's not here, but if we add something, then we see clear to do's, and let's see what that message does. You just get a really cool message on top that says clear to do's. Right, so basically this is what we had in mind to build over here. And this is basically the whole talk, right? So we just wanted to keep it as short and as simple as possible, so it's not really confusing. So if you guys do have any questions about React or anything in general, please go ahead and ask me right now.
Yeah, so I think that was really awesome and cool to learn about. So if we don't have any questions though, I think we're coming to a conclusion then. And